"Your name isn't on the manifest," the gate agent said. Through the glass, Ruth saw her daughter and son boarding without her, smiling. They booked the trip, chose the seats, left their widowed mother at the gate. No warning, no apology. She bought herself a first-class ticket and started rewriting her will at 30,000 feet. By the time they landed in paradise, they were already written out. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. They waved at me from the glass, smiling, like I was luggage they'd already checked. Ruth had her passport ready before they even asked for it. Her nails were painted soft coral, her suitcase wheels oiled with WD-40 the night before. She wore the blouse her daughter had complimented last Mother's Day, the one with tiny hibiscus blossoms embroidered near the collar. She had triple-checked the group text that said, "Don't worry about anything, Mom, just show up." So she did. Gate 37 gleamed with early morning fluorescence. The scent of coffee, Jet A fuel, and lemony floor polish lingered in the air. She spotted them before she reached the counter, Heather scrolling through her phone, Brad leaning against a column, earbuds in. Both of them looked relaxed. Ruth smiled and waved, dragging her carry-on toward them. But as she approached, Heather stood, eyes wide with faux surprise. "Oh, you made it," she said, the way one might greet a +1 at the wrong wedding. Ruth tilted her head. "Of course I made it. I was on time. Like always." Brad gave her a quick nod, pulled one earbud out. "Hey, Mom." It wasn't warm, just enough not to be rude. The gate agent called out, "Group 3 boarding now." Honolulu Maui direct. Ruth stepped forward and handed over her boarding pass, except when she looked down, her phone screen was still on the home screen. There was no ticket, no QR code, no check-in confirmation. She frowned. "I think I need to get my seat number again. I'm traveling with them." The agent tapped at her keyboard, then paused. "Ma'am, you're not listed on this reservation." Ruth blinked. "That can't be right. My daughter and son booked everything. It was a family trip. They said they handled it. I'm sorry, but there's no Ruth Keating attached to this itinerary. Only 5 names: Brad Keating, Heather Vaughn, her husband, and their 2 boys. Ruth turned toward her children. Heather's face was blank for a beat. Then she gave a tight smile, one that tried to pass for casual. "Oh, right," she said into the awkward silence. "There weren't enough seats on this flight. We figured you'd just catch the next one. It's no big deal. They have flights all day." Ruth's throat tightened. "You didn't tell me that." Heather laughed, but it landed wrong. "I thought Brad told you." Brad shrugged. "We assumed you'd be fine." Ruth stood still, her body absorbing the statement like a slap made of velvet. "Fine." They waved as they walked down the jet bridge, her daughter mouthing, "See you soon," as if they'd parted at a mall food court, not abandoned her at an airport gate. She watched through the wide pane of glass as the plane reversed from the terminal. Heather leaned toward the window from inside and grinned. Ruth caught the glint of her son-in-law's watch as he raised a coffee cup in a mock toast, like she was something they'd already checked. She turned back to the counter, her voice clear and composed. "When is the next available flight to Kahului?" The gate agent typed quickly. "One leaves in 3 hours. Economy is fully booked, but there's a seat in first class." Ruth took a slow breath. "I'll take it." The woman hesitated. "It's not cheap. I didn't ask for the price." Ruth pulled out her credit card, the one in her name only, untouched since Michael passed, and slid it across the counter. "Window seat, please." 3 hours later, she reclined in 2A, the flight attendant placing a glass of champagne into her hand before takeoff. The cold, dry bubbles tasted like something new. Not celebration, clarity. The island would still be there when she landed. The villa, the ocean, the rehearsed surprise on Heather's face. But right now, at 30,000 feet, Ruth opened her phone, tapped into notes, and typed 3 words into a new folder. Exit strategy. In the air, sipping champagne, Ruth writes a new folder name in her phone. Exit strategy. They booked a villa for 5, but the keycard had no 6th. Ruth stepped off the plane into a heat she didn't recognize. Not the cloying, sticky kind from home, but something softer, warm, fragrant, as if the island was trying to welcome her even when no one else had. She walked with unhurried precision past the line of family vans and shuttle services. At the rental desk, she smiled at the young man behind the counter and requested the smallest convertible they had. Red, if possible. Something impractical. 10 minutes later, wind tugged at her short gray hair as she pulled onto the coastal road. Maui spread out like a promise she no longer had to share. The boutique hotel she'd found that morning, just a few miles from the resort villa Heather had booked, was perched on a quiet bluff. It smelled of sea salt and hibiscus, not chlorine and sunscreen. Her room overlooked the water. The front desk staff greeted her by name. There was a handwritten welcome card on her pillow. She wasn't invisible here. No one texted that night. No one asked if she made it. By the next evening, still nothing. On the second morning, Ruth dressed in white linen, wide sunglasses, and sandals with just enough heel to lift her chin. She drove to the resort where the family was staying, not to check in, but to observe. The pool deck was crowded with laughter and humidity. She spotted them before they saw her. Heather reclining with a glossy magazine, Brad half submerged in the pool with his sons, both boys squealing as they splashed. Her daughter's husband scrolled through his phone, drink sweating on the concrete beside him. Ruth stood still for a beat longer than necessary. Then, as if the universe had nudged her, Heather glanced up and blinked. "Oh, you made it," she called, sitting up slightly. Ruth smiled, walked closer, noted the details. No extra towel, no vacant chair, no welcome drink, not even a half-hearted wave from the boys. "I'm staying nearby," she said simply. Heather blinked. "Oh, you didn't check in here?" Ruth shrugged. Didn't seem like there was room. They all laughed, a little too hard. "You know we just didn't think," Heather started. Ruth tilted her head. "You didn't." Heather trailed off. "Well, come sit?" There was nowhere to sit. Ruth glanced around. Every chair was claimed, every umbrella occupied. She gave a small nod, as if confirming a decision to herself. "I'll see you at dinner," she said, her voice breezy. That evening, she arrived before them, not at their table but across the patio, a corner seat with a full view of the ocean and the family. She ordered wine, appetizer, entree, her own dessert. Heather waved awkwardly when she noticed her mid-bite. Ruth raised her glass, not in greeting but in acknowledgement, then returned to her view. Later, in her hotel room, she kicked off her sandals and opened her laptop. The cursor blinked on a document she hadn't touched in years, her estate plan. She reviewed it line by line, old beneficiaries, outdated clauses, generous assumptions. Then she opened her email and composed a message to her attorney. Subject: Revision required. I'd like to update the estate file. We'll be making changes. Quietly. She clicked send, closed the laptop, stood by the balcony for a moment, listening to the hush of waves. Not loneliness, just clarity. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was from Brad. "We're thinking of doing this again for Christmas. Thoughts?" Brad texts her. "We're thinking of doing this again for Christmas. Thoughts? I raised them to be generous. They raised me to be invisible." Ruth reflects on decades of unpaid caregiving, raising Heather's boys, covering Brad's debt. She walks along the shoreline, thinking through small indignities that added up over time. Creates a private list in her phone, times I was excluded, but smiled anyway. The count reaches 23 before dinner. At brunch, Heather jokes to a stranger. She likes doing her own thing. Ruth sips her mimosa, internally revises that narrative. Now I actually do. She books a trust planning meeting the day after her return. I raised them to be generous. They raised me to be invisible. The rental car's side mirror caught her in a flicker of morning light, chin lifted, lips pursed, eyes hidden behind tortoiseshell sunglasses. She barely recognized herself, not in the way grief changes you, but in the way quiet realization does. Ruth didn't look older. She looked done. The ocean was still cool when her feet sank into the morning sand. The beach, just past her hotel's garden gate, was nearly empty. A few couples walked hand in hand, early risers chasing the pink bleed of sunrise. Ruth walked alone, slowly, deliberately. The hem of her linen pants dampened where it brushed the surf. She wasn't thinking about the trip anymore, not the one they planned without her, or the villa she'd never stepped foot inside. Her mind had gone further back, years, decades even. She remembered holding Heather's first baby at midnight so her daughter could get 6 straight hours of sleep. She remembered writing a check to clear Brad's college debt, telling him it was a graduation gift so he wouldn't feel ashamed. She remembered babysitting for entire weekends so they could reconnect with their spouses. No pay, no thank you card, not even a text when she'd leave their houses late at night, letting herself out quietly with dishes still in the sink. Back then, it hadn't hurt, not in real time. She'd swallowed every slight with the kind of grace that looks a lot like surrender. But now, on this island, this morning, she felt the weight of all those swallowed things. A stomach doesn't forget. Ruth stopped walking, pulled out her phone, opened the Notes app, typed, "Times I was excluded, but smiled anyway." Her thumbs moved faster than expected. Heather's wedding seating chart, Brad's first promotion dinner, the boys' recitals, invites that came 30 minutes before, the baby shower where she brought the food and wasn't listed as a host. Last Thanksgiving. "We thought you'd be with Gloria." She kept going. 23 entries by the time her feet turned back toward the hotel path. She didn't cry. She smiled, a new kind, not warm, not bitter, just finished. Later that morning, the family insisted she join them for brunch at the resort buffet. Ruth arrived in a soft periwinkle dress and gold sandals. She carried nothing but her phone and a lipstick the color of muted defiance. As they waited in line, Heather leaned toward a tourist couple who'd complimented her children. "She's my mom," Heather said brightly. "She likes doing her own thing." Ruth turned slightly, just enough to meet the couple's gaze and smile. "I used to," she said calmly. "Now I'm learning how." They laughed, thinking it was a joke. Heather didn't. Ruth clinked her mimosa gently against her glass, sipped, made no toasts. When they parted ways after brunch, Heather heading to the spa, Brad corralling the kids, Ruth returned to her hotel, her steps lighter than they had been in years. She didn't feel like a passenger anymore. She felt like her own itinerary. In her room, she made one more list. Appointments to schedule. Estate planning attorney, banker, separate accounts, trust specialist. The final entry she typed slowly. One-way ticket to peace of mind. She picked up the room phone and dialed the front desk. "Hi, could you help me find a local notary? I may have some documents to sign before I check out." She schedules a trust meeting the day after she returns. "They remembered me when they needed rest, not when I needed respect." Ruth was barely through her own front door, suitcase wheels still tracking airport dust across her foyer, when her phone buzzed. The screen lit up with Heather's name. "Can you babysit Tuesday night? We're gonna be jet-lagged and wrecked. No greeting. No, glad you're home safe." Just the same automatic request machine she'd become in their minds. Always on, always available, like a subscription they forgot they stopped paying for. Ruth stood there for a moment, holding the phone in her palm like it might burn her. She looked around her quiet living room. Sunlight streamed in through the sheer curtains, landing on her orchid by the window, still blooming, still lovely, unbothered by absence. She typed slowly, "I'm unavailable, but you'll figure it out." Then she muted the thread. By dinner, Heather had called 3 times and left one voicemail laced with false sweetness. "Hi, Mom, just got your text. I guess that's your right. Just wish you'd communicate a little more clearly instead of being, passive-aggressive. Anyway, call me." An hour later, Brad followed up with a meme. A cartoon grandma in aviator shades and leather pants holding a cocktail. Text over it read, "When you hit 70 and stop giving a damn." No caption, just vibes. Ruth didn't reply. She printed it, slid it into a manila folder labeled Perception versus Presence. Then she sat at her desk and opened the living trust document she'd begun updating in Maui. Her reading glasses rested lower on her nose, her handwriting neat but deliberate as she made a new notation at the bottom of the family inheritance clause. "Legacy requires presence, not performance." She capped the pen and leaned back in her chair. For most of her adult life, she'd been praised for being easy, low maintenance, chill. She'd thought those words meant she was gracious. Turns out they just meant she demanded nothing and got exactly that in return. That weekend, Ruth signed up for a community center dance class. It was on a whim. She saw the flyer in a cafe window. Solo steps. Movement for women over 60. The class met in a mirror-lined studio with a creaky wooden floor and music that sounded like memory. Nina Simone, Sam Cooke, even the Temptations. Ruth stood barefoot with 6 other women, none of whom asked about her children. The instructor, a woman with gray braids and silver bangles, spoke like she'd seen some things. "We don't care what you look like," she said, "only that you show up, for yourself." Ruth moved. Not gracefully, not flawlessly, but fully. Her hips remembered rhythms her heart had long forgotten. For 60 minutes there was no estate plan, no Heather, no Brad, just music and movement and space. After class, she didn't feel sore. She felt electric. Back at home, she opened her laptop and typed a message to her banker. Subject: Joint Account Revisions. "I'd like to review all shared accounts. My goal is to go solo across the board." That same afternoon, she revoked all financial authorizations for Heather and Brad. Bank access, auto payments, co-signed cards, cleared. She requested a fresh set of checks with only her name, updated the titles on 2 investment accounts, and even changed the contact info on her utility bills. She was reclaiming every thread, one line item at a time. The next morning, her inbox chimed. A message from her attorney. "You'll need to designate a new beneficiary by next week." Ruth looked out the window, fingers poised over the keys. Not bitter, not hesitant, just ready. Lawyer emails. "You'll need to designate a new beneficiary by next week." They left me at the gate. I left them off the deed. Ruth sat across from Lily at her kitchen table, the same table where birthday cakes had been sliced, school photos had been framed, and bills were once sorted with her late husband by her side. The table was quieter now, but not empty. A vase of dahlias sat in the center, bright orange and blood red, their petals reaching like they had something to prove. Lily had brought them without fanfare, placing them down before she even set her purse on the chair. "No reason," she said, "just saw them and thought of you." That was Lily. No strings, no subtext, just presence, steady, consistent, unasked for. Ruth poured tea into both mugs and studied her goddaughter over the rim. 29, with an archivist's calm and a painter's eye. Ruth had mentored her through undergrad, late-night calls about finals, practice interviews, rent emergencies, and never once had Lily assumed repayment in the form of obligation. "I saw the email," Ruth said, finally breaking the silence. "From my attorney." Lily sipped her tea and raised an eyebrow. "You're revising the trust?" Ruth nodded. "I am." She slid a folder across the table. Inside, valuation statements, property documents, and a fresh draft of her living trust. The front page listed total assets, $1.4 million between the house, brokerage accounts, pension, and savings. Lily didn't touch the folder. "I'm not here for that," she said softly. "I know," Ruth replied. "That's why you're the only one who's getting it." Lily looked up, her lips parting, then pressing into a thin line. Her eyes shone, but she didn't cry. "I haven't earned that." "You've shown up," Ruth said. "You've shown care. You've respected my time without expecting it to serve yours. You've never once treated me like a bank or a backup plan. You don't need to earn anything. You've already been someone who'd never leave me standing at a gate." They sat in silence for a moment, tea growing cooler between them. Later that afternoon, Ruth met her attorney, Renee, in the firm's conference room. Polished oak table, soft close drawers, and a digital wall screen that felt more like a verdict machine than a design feature. Renee reviewed the updates line by line, reading aloud the final clause Ruth had requested. "Descendants removed due to documented neglect, emotional dereliction, and abandonment during periods of familial vulnerability. This clause is irrevocable." Renee looked up. "You sure about this?" Ruth didn't blink. "I've never been more sure." The signatures came next, then the notary stamp, then the filing. By the end of the appointment, her entire estate had been sealed, irrevocable, ironclad, and bound with legal thread too tight to unravel. She took her copy home and placed it in her safe. Not tucked under old documents, not hidden behind tax returns. Front, center. She slipped it into a folder labeled Boarding Pass, Final. That evening, she let herself exhale for the first time in weeks. She played Ella Fitzgerald while cooking dinner. Rosemary chicken, lemon rice, and roasted carrots slick with honey and olive oil. She lit a candle and poured herself a single glass of wine. It wasn't celebration. It was certainty. Halfway through her meal, her phone buzzed on the countertop. She didn't check it immediately. The music was good and the carrots were crisp on the edges. But curiosity won. A message from Brad. Thinking of flipping your house one day? Want to see what renovations would cost? Ruth read it twice, then 3 times. She didn't respond. She just smiled, folded her napkin, and added a fresh page to the Perception Verses, Presents folder. Brad texts, thinking of flipping your house one day, want to see what renovations would cost? They started planning renos, I started planning removals. Ruth didn't respond to Brad's text. Not with a what? Not with a you must be confused. Not even with a period. She let it sit, like a moldy idea sealed behind glass. Then she opened her laptop and requested a full title report from the county assessor. She already knew what it would confirm, but she wanted the hard copy, with signatures and stamps, in her own hands. Owner of record, Ruth Elaine Keating. No secondary title holders, no co-signed mortgage, no transfer of ownership, no Brad. Next, she called her HOA, where Brad had once casually mentioned he'd asked a few questions on her behalf about fencing height and exterior paint colors. The customer service rep was polite until Ruth asked, "Can you confirm who's listed as the authorized property contact?" The woman paused, then cleared her throat. "We actually had a note from a Brad Keating requesting access for renovation estimates, bathroom and kitchen expansion. It says He is not on the deed," Ruth said, her voice like cold silver. "And he is not authorized. Please remove his name from every file. Immediately." "Yes, ma'am." By sundown, Brad's access to anything beyond her front lawn had evaporated. The next morning, Ruth met with a financial advisor, one she hadn't used before because she needed someone unentangled. The office smelled like eucalyptus and leather, and the woman behind the desk had the kind of confident calm Ruth associated with judges and airline pilots. "I'd like to structure my estate distribution," Ruth said plainly, "but with conditions." "Conditions?" the woman asked, intrigued. "Performance-based," Ruth said. "Presence-based. Respect-based." The advisor raised one brow. "You're drafting a will with performance reviews." Ruth sipped her water. "Exactly." They went clause by clause. No inheritance without 5 years of emotional presence, no contact, no cash. A clause for caregivers, not manipulators. A clause for Ava, Brad's daughter, should she ever prove independent in thought and integrity. A clause for Lily, locked, untouchable. By the time they were done, the trust read less like a gift and more like a test. She retitled her home that same day, transferred from personal ownership into a private trust bearing a name no one in her family would recognize. It was now protected, invisible to public searches and casual ambition. No flipping, no forecasting, no future they could budget with her walls in mind. That evening, she sat on her porch, wrapped in a knit shawl that had once belonged to her mother. The sky stretched wide and pink, but her mind was sharper than the horizon. She scrolled Instagram out of idle habit. There it was, a photo from Heather. Her daughter had posted a picture of the two of them, years old, maybe 10, taken at a Mother's Day brunch where Ruth had picked up the check and Heather had picked at her salad. In the photo, Heather smiled like she'd never forgotten a thing. Ruth remembered being bone-tired that day and still offering to drive everyone home. The caption read, "Always grateful, even if they forget. Blessed, sa moms rock. Remembering what matters." The performance was immaculate. The fiction was flattering. The comments poured in. Likes, heart emojis, affirmations of what a beautiful bond they had. Ruth didn't comment. She didn't even screenshot it. She simply clicked Save to Archive, added it to her private folder labeled Digital Fiction, then shut off the app entirely. Let them curate memories. She had the receipts. Heather posts a throwback photo with the caption, "Always grateful, even if they forget. They praised me online. I archived their absence in person." Ruth sat at her desk with the lights low and the blinds half drawn, the late afternoon sun striping across the hardwood like quiet judgment. Her laptop was open, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, and a stack of printed screenshots lay neatly beside her. She hadn't meant to start a collection, but the posts kept coming. Heather had posted another smiling photo, a collage this time. One was of Ruth holding baby bottles. Another showed her mid-laugh, cropped artfully to suggest an idyllic brunch that Ruth only remembered for being asked to just Venmo it later. The caption read, "She's the glue. Always has been. Couldn't do life without her." Ruth pressed Command plus Shift plus 4, her fingers calm. The screen blinked. Another addition to the folder she had renamed Digital Fiction. She printed the post. Then the comments. "Such a beautiful bond. Lucky to have a mom like that. Goals. You can see the love." Ruth printed them all. 3-hole punched them, slid them into a binder behind a tab labeled Public Narrative, Private Absence. That week, her city's Literacy Foundation emailed to confirm her award. She'd volunteered there every Thursday morning for 8 years, reading to adults struggling through GED prep, helping women in shelters write resumes, leading evening sessions on how to advocate through paperwork and letters. She'd never done it for recognition, but they were honoring her anyway. The ceremony was small but thoughtful, white linen tables, a podium decorated in fall flowers, tea lights flickering in mason jars. Ruth arrived early and sat in the second row, legs crossed at the ankle, hands folded calmly over her clutch. She didn't expect Heather or Brad to come, but she had sent the invitation anyway. Silence. That night? Silence again. But Lily showed up, in a plum dress and worn flats with eyeliner she clearly didn't wear often. She held a bouquet of white tulips and sat straight through the entire ceremony, hands trembling when Ruth's name was called. When Ruth stepped up to the mic, she looked out at the crowd, faces she didn't know well, but who had shown up. "I've spent much of my life making sure others could get where they were going," she began, voice steady. "But sometimes when you find yourself left behind, you learn to chart your own route." She paused. "And sometimes that route leads to first class." The crowd chuckled, not quite sure whether it was a joke. Lily wiped a tear. Back at home, Ruth placed the award plaque beside her travel journal, a little altar of earned space. She opened the journal, flipped past her Maui notes and scribbled a new line under the heading, "Things I Carried Home." "They gave me nothing at the gate. I gave myself first class." Later that night, Ruth's phone buzzed. She expected it to be Lily. It wasn't. It was Facebook. Heather Vaughn tagged you in a photo. She sighed and clicked. It was a cozy scene. Heather's living room lit by string lights, mugs of cocoa raised in a toast. Brad's kids in matching pajamas, a fake fireplace looping on the TV behind them. The caption read, "Family ski trip. Here we come. Holidays. Together. Your tradition time." Ruth's name wasn't tagged in the body of the post, no mention of her in the comments, no text asking if she'd be interested, no "we should talk about plans," just silence, framed in artificial warmth. She closed the app, didn't comment, didn't call. Instead, she turned the page in her journal and wrote just 4 words, "Not on the list." Holiday plans emerge. Ruth isn't invited. The dinner table shrunk. So did my patience. Ruth read the Facebook caption again. The words hadn't changed. "Family ski trip, here we come. Holidays, together. Tradition time." Her name wasn't tagged. Her face wasn't in the carousel. Her phone hadn't rung. The list of comments grew longer with every scroll. "Can't wait to see pics. You guys do holidays right. Heather, you're amazing. Family glue." That word again. Glue. Ruth closed her laptop and slid it across the table with the same care someone might use to push away a plate they didn't order. She didn't sigh. She didn't pace. She just stopped. No calls, no texts, not even to Lily. She needed quiet, not sympathy. That night, she went to her closet and pulled down a box labeled Winter Misk. Inside, nestled beneath scarves she hadn't worn in years, was a travel journal she'd tucked away long ago, marked by a sticky note that read, North Carolina 2003, just in case. Back then, she'd almost gone alone. She didn't. This time, she would. By morning, she had a solo reservation at a cabin in the Smoky Mountains, small, self-contained, with a wood-burning stove and a porch swing that faced the ridge. She didn't check if there was Wi-Fi. She didn't care. She packed only one suitcase. By the second evening, the cold was sharp enough to demand fire. Ruth lit one herself. The matches were damp, but she coaxed the flame anyway, feeding it slowly with slivers of bark and patience. She poured a glass of bourbon she'd picked up on the way in. Spicy, clean, exactly enough. Pulled out her will. She reread every word by the firelight. Nothing surprised her, but one name emerged in her mind, quiet as snowfall. Maya, daughter of her oldest friend, Diane. Ruth had watched her grow up, had held her during Diane's chemo appointments, had quietly paid the hospital bill when Diane died. Maya had just had a baby of her own. Ruth had sent a quilt, handmade, no note. That kind of presence, the kind that lingered even when no one saw it, that mattered. She took out her pen and added one line beneath the existing clause, to Maya F., for her tenderness and strength, should she ever need it, $25,000 for the first steps of motherhood. It wasn't grand, but it was precise. Earned. She logged the change, dated it, and closed the folder. No announcement. No ceremony. The fire popped. Outside, wind moved through the trees like a distant chorus. Ruth walked to the window. The mountains stood solid, unbothered by noise. She raised her glass toward them, not in toast but in agreement. Some structures don't ask to be seen. They just exist, immovable. Her phone hadn't buzzed all day. And then it did. Not a text, a call. Brad. She let it ring once, twice. Then picked up, but said nothing. Hey, Mom, his voice came after a pause, oddly careful. We've been talking, and I was wondering if you'd be open to a sit-down sometime soon, just the three of us, about everything, especially, inheritance. He let the word hang like smoke. We want to understand where things stand. If we can meet, I think it'd be really good for everyone. Ruth didn't respond. Not immediately. Instead, she walked over to the fireplace, stirred the logs, and watched one split open, glowing red from the inside out. Brad calls, "We want to talk inheritance. Can we meet?" They thought, "I'd forget. I remembered everything, with receipts." The cafe smelled faintly of cinnamon and burnt espresso. It was the kind of place Ruth had chosen carefully, not too upscale to put them on guard, not too casual to suggest she hadn't thought this through. She sat at a window table with soft morning light falling across her shoulders, a half-empty mug of tea growing cool beside her. She had arrived early, as always. Brad entered first, punctual, carrying a sleek laptop bag and wearing the look of someone who thought this would be a negotiation. Heather followed moments later, more relaxed, phone in one hand and a reusable coffee cup in the other. They both approached the table with the kind of polite smiles reserved for holiday dinners after long silences. "Hey, Mom," Brad said as he slid into the seat across from her. His voice was light but rehearsed. "Appreciate you making time." Heather sat beside him and added, "It's good to see you." "You look well." Ruth offered a nod. "I am." The silence that followed was thin but tense, like sugar glass ready to shatter. Brad opened his laptop and pulled out a manila folder filled with spreadsheets and tabbed printouts. "So," he began, "we've been thinking a lot about legacy planning and wanted to talk through some ideas that could be a win for everyone. It's really just about setting up long-term security. For you, of course, but also for the family structure moving forward." He pushed a paper forward. Heather leaned in with a warm tone Ruth had seen her use on clients at open houses. "We know some of this might feel technical," she said gently, "but we figured you'd appreciate us being proactive." Ruth looked at the chart, a neat layout of estate flow models, tax-deferred vehicles, charitable gifting options, and a timeline labeled transition planning. Her name was printed in bold across the top, like a company they hoped to acquire. Proactive, Ruth repeated softly. Brad smiled. Exactly. This doesn't have to be complicated. We can set up a family foundation, maybe a donor-advised fund. You'd be the figurehead, of course. We'd just help facilitate. Heather added, It would be in your honor. Ruth let the silence stretch a moment longer. The tea had cooled completely, but she took another sip anyway. Her hands didn't tremble. You seem to have done a lot of work on this, she said calmly. Brad nodded, encouraged. We just want things to be smooth. Ruth reached into her leather tote and withdrew a single white envelope. It wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. She placed it on the table between them like a check that didn't need to clear. Heather reached for it first and unfolded the page. Her eyebrows knit together before she read aloud, her voice catching somewhere between disbelief and dawning comprehension. This removes us? From the trust? Brad leaned over to see. What? The paper was clear. Not cold, just final. A notarized letter confirming that as of a specific date, already passed, both Heather Vaughn and Bradley Keating had been formally and permanently excluded from all assets, inheritances, executor privileges, and power of attorney roles related to the estate of Ruth Elaine Keating. Brad's voice sharpened. You're doing this out of spite. No, Ruth said, her voice soft but immovable. I'm doing this out of record. Heather's tone strained to sound composed. We didn't mean to make you feel... You didn't think about how I'd feel at all, Ruth said, finishing the sentence for her. You used my time, my presence, my silence. You counted on it like an automatic deposit. Brad pushed the papers back toward her, frustrated. So, that's it? You've decided we're nothing to you? Ruth stood slowly, slipping the empty envelope back into her bag. Her coat rested on the chair behind her, but she didn't rush to put it on. You decided that, she said. I just documented it. She walked out of the cafe without another word, her boots quiet against the tile. She didn't look back. The cold air outside met her like a handshake, sharp, honest, and unavoidably real. By the time she reached her car, her phone buzzed. A notification from Facebook. Heather Vaughn has posted a status. She didn't need to read it, but she did. Cut off without warning. The elderly need better mental health support. Check in on your parents. You never know what they're battling. Ruth didn't reply. She took a screenshot, then added it to her private folder labeled Weaponized Concern. Heather posts a vague status. Cut off without warning. The elderly need better mental health support. They questioned my mind, so I documented every page. Ruth didn't sleep much that night, not because she was upset, but because her mind was too clear to rest. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop asking if you were overreacting and start documenting exactly what you've endured. By morning, she had already printed the cafe receipt and filed it beneath the tab labeled Face-to-Face Fiction. She slid Heather's Facebook post, mental health support and all, into the section behind it. But this time, she took one step further. At 9 a.m. sharp, Ruth called her primary care physician and requested a formal cognitive evaluation. Not an online quiz, not a screening, a full neurological and memory assessment, standardized, certified, and admissible. The receptionist asked if she was concerned about anything. No, Ruth said with perfect articulation, but it seems others are. The appointment was set for the following week. Ruth arrived in a navy blazer and pressed slacks, her hair neatly pulled back. The neuropsychologist, a woman in her 40s with soft eyes and a precise tone, greeted her with the kind of measured neutrality reserved for court-adjacent proceedings. Over 2 hours, Ruth answered memory drills, pattern recognition tests, logical reasoning, reading comprehension, and long-form verbal analysis. She described current events in detail, listed 10 governors by name, and explained, by choice, the difference between a revocable and irrevocable trust. The doctor smiled faintly at the end. If anything, your mind's a few notches above average for your age. Ruth didn't smile back. I'll need that in writing. Within 72 hours, the sealed copy was filed with her attorney. A second copy was placed in her medical chart. A third, notarized, went into her home safe behind the will. She didn't need them yet, but she would not be questioned again. That same afternoon, Ruth called Renee, her estate lawyer, and requested one additional clause. "I want it added clearly, early in the document, nothing hidden in fine print." "Added language?" Renee asked. "Yes," Ruth said. "Any party who attempts to contest my mental fitness or decision-making capacity forfeits all access to residual funds, insurance settlements, retirement transfers, and material belongings, immediately and without appeal." Renee didn't hesitate. "Understood." That night, Ruth made tea and opened her laptop. She hadn't intended to publish anything, but there was one essay she'd been drafting since Maui, part travel log, part letter to herself. She'd titled it, "The First-Class Trip That Changed My Will." It began with a gate number and ended with a folder name, Exit Strategy. The post wasn't angry. It didn't mention her children by name. It simply told the truth about being left, about choosing herself, and about the power of changing your documents instead of raising your voice. Lily came by the next day, a flash drive in hand and a soft energy that filled the kitchen. "I've been thinking," she said, settling at the table. "If you ever want to digitize your journals or archive your writing, I could help. You've got decades of voice in here. It deserves to outlive paper." Ruth nodded slowly, touched by the offer, surprised by how right it felt. "Let's do it. I'm ready." They worked side by side, scanning and typing, Lily reading aloud lines Ruth had forgotten she'd written. Some entries made them laugh, some made Lily cry. By the end of the week, Ruth's blog had gone live. She expected silence, but something shifted. A women's nonprofit in Oregon reposted it with the caption, "For every mother who had to buy her own boarding pass." A retirement financial planner linked to it on her newsletter. A legal autonomy group for elder women shared it with the note, "This is what clarity looks like." 2 days later, Ruth received an email from a mid-sized publisher in New York. Subject, "Travel Memoir, Submission Inquiry." They wanted to see more, maybe shape it into something larger. That evening, Lily stayed for dinner. After dessert, she looked at Ruth thoughtfully and asked, "What happens if they try to contact you again?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She leaned back in her chair, the light from the dining room soft across her hands. "I suppose," she said finally, "that depends on whether they're calling as children or creditors." Lily asks, "What happens if they try to contact you again?" "I left the gate quietly, so they'd never hear the door close. There was no press release, no announcement, just paperwork. It began with a notarized letter sent via certified mail to her attorney, her doctor, and the financial institution that managed her retirement accounts. One sentence sat centered in bold. "Effective immediately, Heather Vaughn and Bradley Keating are barred from direct or representative contact with all fiduciary, medical, and legal agents of Ruth Elaine Keating." It wasn't vengeful. It was infrastructural. With one document, the door had not only closed, it had been soundproofed. Next came the proxy forms. At her kitchen table, Ruth smoothed out a single page marked "Medical Power of Attorney." Her signature was neat, steady. The pen didn't skip once. She printed Lily's name at the top and listed her emergency contact number on 3 separate lines, just to be thorough. For end-of-life directives, she left no space for interpretation. Then she added one final field, Gloria Matthews, her neighbor and friend of 30 years. They'd shared soup recipes, lawn care referrals, and losses. Both had buried husbands within a year of each other. Gloria had stood with her through the early tremors of widowhood when grief didn't cry. It hovered. Gloria would be her backup executor, a second safeguard. Ruth walked the papers to the mailbox herself. That evening, she lit a candle and pulled out a box from the hallway closet. It was the one marked "Personal-Hold Until Needed." Inside, she placed a new manila envelope with all the documents, estate directives, healthcare preferences, burial instructions, and a copy of her cognitive exam, triple stamped. It was all there in black and white, but she wasn't finished. She went to her writing desk and pulled out a fresh pack of stationery, cream-colored, weighty, the kind that made a letter feel like a commitment. One by one, she began to write. Not apologies, not explanations. Truths. There was one for Heather. A detailed account of every time she'd shown up to support without acknowledgement. The silent car rides, the forgotten birthdays, the nights spent babysitting while Heather called it freedom. There was one for Brad, a note that documented the check she'd written to keep his mortgage current, the car repair she never told him she covered, the thankless Christmases where he'd offered her leftovers in a foil tray and called it low-key family time. Each letter ended with the same sentence, "This is what you left behind." She sealed them carefully, each envelope marked with a name and a date. Some would be delivered upon her passing, others, maybe, never at all. But they existed, and that was enough. Her story would be told, even if she never spoke it aloud again. Once done, she placed them into a locked cabinet drawer, closed it with a soft push, turned the key, hung it on a ribbon, tucked it into her jewelry box. No drama. Just design. Outside, the late afternoon sun angled across her porch in golden lines. Ruth made herself tea and took her seat by the window, letting the warmth steep into her bones. She didn't feel lonely. She felt protected. Her phone buzzed once, a soft hum on the countertop. She didn't rush to check it, assuming it might be Lily or a shipping notice from one of the local bookstores she'd recently supported. But it wasn't either of those. It was an email. From Ava Keating. Subject: Hello. Ruth clicked it open, her hand still steady from the letters she'd just sealed. Hi, Grandma. I know we haven't spoken in a long time, but I'd really like to visit. If you're open to that. Just me. No one else. I want to hear your story. The real one. Hope to see you soon. Ava Ruth stared at the screen for a long time, her expression unreadable even to herself. She took a slow sip of tea, then closed her eyes. Not a storm, not a reopening, but maybe, just maybe, a passenger arriving late with her own suitcase in hand. Ruth receives an email from Ava, Brad's daughter, asking to visit. She wanted to know the story, not the spin. Ruth waited for the doorbell, but it never came. Instead, she looked up from the kitchen window and saw Ava standing just past the walkway, shoulders squared, one hand loosely gripping the strap of a canvas tote bag. She was thinner than Ruth remembered, her hair darker, cropped into a blunt chin-length cut that made her look older than 17, but her face, still soft around the mouth, still searching, held no trace of performance. Ruth opened the front door, but didn't call out. Just waited. Ava stepped forward, cautious but steady. When she reached the porch, she pulled her phone from her pocket and held it up. I left it in the car, she said, showing the screen. No recordings. No tracking. Just me. Ruth nodded once and moved aside. Inside, the house felt warmer than usual. Maybe because Ruth had let the bread finish baking earlier than planned, or maybe because some corners of the silence weren't defensive anymore. They were ready. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Lily had typed Ruth's journal pages, where decisions had been folded into memory like linen into drawers. I don't believe everything they say, Ava said quietly, eyes focused on the rim of her teacup. I mean, I know they love me. But love doesn't always mean truth. Ruth didn't interrupt. She didn't nod or offer platitudes. She simply poured a second cup and pushed over the sugar bowl. I've seen the posts, Ava continued. The ones that sound like eulogies written for people who aren't even dead yet. I know when something feels fake. The house settled around them. No creaks, no clock ticks. Just the faint hum of the fridge and the weight of things neither of them had inherited yet. Ruth stood, disappeared briefly, and returned with a slim folder. Photos, she said. And recipes. Some of my writing. If you want to see it. Ava opened the folder slowly. There was a photo of Ruth in her 20s, on a train platform in Boston, smiling with a backpack nearly half her size, a Christmas cookie recipe in Ruth's loopy cursive, and the first draft of an essay printed in sepia ink on thick paper, boarding alone. Ruth watched as Ava's eyes moved across the lines. At one point, the girl pressed a sleeve to her cheek, wiping something away quickly, like she didn't want to make it a moment. I would have sat next to you, Ava said softly, not looking up. Ruth didn't speak. She simply reached out and took Ava's hand, not for pity, not for promise, just to mark it, what it meant to be seen. After a while, Ava stood. "I don't want anything," she said. "I just didn't want their version to be the only one." Ruth walked her to the door. Before she left, Ava hesitated and added, "If you ever write a book, I hope you include this." "I already am," Ruth said. That night, Ruth logged into her credit union account and opened a new custodial savings file, set to mature at age 25. The amount wasn't massive, just enough for a quiet yes when the world might hand her a no. In the notes field, she typed, "For Ava, for the one who asked." Then she locked the folder with a digital pin, her birth year, reversed. The next morning, Ruth opened her email while buttering a piece of toast. The subject line stood out against the gray of promotions and notifications. Subject, "Congratulations. We'd like to feature your essay." It was from American Thoughtline, a national magazine with a readership Ruth hadn't expected to know her name. They wanted to publish the first-class trip that changed my will in their spring issue, paired with a personal profile and a professional photo shoot. She read it twice, then a third time. Somewhere behind her, the toaster clicked back into silence. Ruth's essay is accepted by a national magazine. "They left me last. The world listed me first." The magazine hit stands on a Tuesday. It arrived in Ruth's mailbox with a soft thud beneath catalogs and coupons, its glossy cover thick with spring pastels. The title curled neatly over a photograph of a woman at an airport terminal, backlit, anonymous, silver-haired, hand resting lightly on a rolling suitcase. Inside, 5 pages in, her story. "Boarding pass denied, will updated," by Ruth E. Keating. It read cleanly, with only the lightest editorial polish. The core remained hers, a story not of grievance but of boundaries drawn in ink rather than volume. Her tone, measured, exact, unapologetically final, resonated far wider than she could have imagined. The first email came within an hour, then 50 more by noon. Some were short, "Thank you." Others long, unfurling years of silent dismissals. Elderly women passed over at birthdays, mothers dropped from vacation headcounts, grandmothers called only when babysitters failed to show. The phrase repeated like a chorus, "They left me too." By the weekend, her name trended in quiet corners of the internet. Elder law blogs linked to the essay. A retirement investment group shared it during a seminar. Then came the morning shows. A producer from Wake Up Today called Lily, who screened Ruth's calls now. They offered a spot in the final segment. Not just grandmas, women rewriting their wills. Scheduled live on Thursday. It was tastefully done, all soft lighting and warm voices. Ruth sat straight-backed in a navy-wrap dress, silver necklace gleaming, eyes sharper than anyone expected at 68. The host asked her, "What do you say to those who think your choices are too harsh?" Ruth didn't blink. "You don't call pruning harsh. You call it what keeps the tree alive." By Friday, her essay had crossed 4 million reads. She didn't track the numbers obsessively, but the ripples reached her anyway. The mailbox filled every day. Thick, padded envelopes and crisp notes from strangers. One woman sent her a luggage tag that read, "First class forever." A man in Maine enclosed a check, voided for $1, with a note that said, "This is what I gave my son when he demanded my house. Thank you for the courage." Some sent photos of their own altered wills. Ruth read every single one. She kept a shoebox beneath the piano bench labeled "Passengers." When the box overflowed, she started a second one, then a third. Then came the voicemail. "Hey, Mom, it's Heather." The voice was taut, controlled. "I saw the interview. You looked polished. I hope you're proud of yourself." Click. No apology. No question. Just residue. Ruth didn't return the call. She opened her journal instead and wrote, "Their first class was a seat. Mine was a decision." She printed out the final page of her essay, the one that hadn't changed since the first draft, framed it in cherry wood, set it beside her passport, which she'd recently renewed, not out of need, but readiness. "They couldn't find a seat for me. I found the pilot's chair. One morning, while Lily clipped basil in the kitchen window, Ruth opened a padded envelope from her publisher. Inside was the final layout for her memoir's first print run, matte cover, clean serif font, and a dedication page exactly how she'd requested. To the women left at the gate, "You didn't miss the flight, you just built your own wings." By the following week, pre-orders had doubled. The publisher sent a note asking if she'd be open to a second printing. Interest had outpaced forecast. Ruth placed the note in her inbox tray, but didn't rush to reply. She'd reply in her own time. That evening, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, flipping through a worn folder of old receipts and boarding passes. She stopped at one in particular, the first-class stub from that Maui flight. The corner was bent, the ink slightly faded. She smoothed it gently with 2 fingers. Outside, the sky glowed amber behind the rooftops. Inside, her phone buzzed once, soft and steady. Subject: memoir, reprint. Confirmed her travel memoir goes into reprint. I mailed out the will, 1 copy each, not as an invitation, but closure. The documents went out on a Tuesday morning. Ruth stood at the post office counter with 2 crisp, white envelopes in hand, one addressed to Heather Vaughn in suburban Cincinnati, the other to Brad Keating in Atlanta. Both bore the same weight, 9.6 ounces of legal finality. She had enclosed exact copies of the updated trust, including the amendment clauses, the forfeiture conditions, and the notarized record of mental competency. No room for interpretation, no hint of invitation. Each envelope contained a yellow sticky note, identical in her neat block handwriting. "This document requires no reply." The clerk behind the glass scanned them without comment. Ruth paid in cash, took the receipts, walked out into the wind with a feeling that wasn't quite satisfaction, but something firmer, something finished. That afternoon she booked her next trip, Florence. A direct flight, business class, springtime. She'd always wanted to see the Duomo in person, not just as a backdrop in someone else's photo album. This time, no family itinerary, no schedule to accommodate toddler naps or adult tantrums masked as preferences, just herself, a walking map of quiet choices. Ruth packed light. 3 dresses, 1 pair of soft-soled walking shoes, a guidebook marked only with handwritten notes, not bookmarks from other people's plans. She printed her boarding pass early, slid it into her passport, and tucked both inside the side pocket of her luggage, where her old marriage license used to ride when she and Michael traveled together. A day before she left, she sat at her desk with a fresh journal. The cover was linen, pale cream, stitched by hand. Inside the front page, she wrote the first line in deep navy ink. "Once you buy your own seat, you never settle for the aisle." She closed the journal gently and sealed it with a ribbon. That evening, Gloria stopped by with a small box of pastries and a schedule of speaking requests. Word had spread about Ruth's essay and upcoming memoir. Libraries, elder advocacy groups, even a graduate seminar on narrative justice wanted her voice. Gloria read the list aloud while Ruth packed, occasionally pausing to say, "You're allowed to say no, or yes, or maybe later." Ruth smiled and handed her the list. "You decide," she said. "Whatever you choose will be the right answer." Gloria blinked, then nodded, the corners of her eyes going soft. On the morning of her flight, Ruth sent only 2 postcards. One to Lily. "Save the garden stories. I'll bring you wine and more questions when I'm back." The other to Ava. "The olive trees remind me of you. Quiet, strong, rooted." She left her phone at home. Not for rebellion, but for peace. The airport felt different this time, not because it had changed, but because she had. She moved through security without hurry, smiled at the gate agent without needing acknowledgement, and boarded when called. Not before, not after. Seat 3A. A window, the armrest cool beneath her hand. A glass of chilled Prosecco arrived before takeoff. She sipped, watching the tarmac shimmer. No one was saving her a seat, but no one could take this one either. As the plane lifted into soft gray clouds, she didn't look back. Florence welcomed her with rain, not pouring, but thoughtful, the kind that asks you to slow down. Her taxi wound past narrow alleyways and flowered balconies. The air smelled of espresso and stone. At the small inn she'd chosen near Santa Croce, a leather-bound package waited at the front desk. "For Signora Ruth Keating," the clerk said, bowing slightly. Ruth took it to her room, sat on the window seat and untied the twine. Inside, the first advance copy of her memoir. The cover was deep indigo, the title pressed in soft gold foil. Exit Strategy, a departure story. A note tucked inside, handwritten by Lily. "For the women who flew alone and never flew back." Ruth touched the page, let her hand rest there for a long moment, then turned to chapter 1. Lily hands her a leather-bound copy of her book, dedicated. "To the women who flew alone. They didn't save me a seat. I rewrote the boarding order." The departure board blinked once. Flight 328 to Lisbon, on time. Ruth stood at Gate 8, passport tucked neatly into her small leather travel case, the corners worn from use, not neglect. Her hair, streaked in elegant silver, was pulled into a soft twist at the nape of her neck. She wore a long navy coat, buttoned high against the terminal chill, and carried no extra bags, just one polished carry-on that wheeled without complaint. The gate agent smiled as she approached. "Welcome back, Ms. Keating. We have you in 1A again." Ruth returned the smile, unhurried. "Thank you." No double-checking the screen, no nervous searching for her name. It was there, printed, confirmed, declared aloud. She'd come to prefer that seat, not for the view but for what it represented, that you didn't have to be first to arrive in order to be first to claim space. She boarded before the rush, letting the aisle stretch empty before her. The overhead bin above 1A was still open, still waiting. She lifted her carry-on without strain and placed it gently inside, her hand brushing the wall of the compartment like she was greeting an old friend. Then she sat down. Window seat. The leather was cool beneath her palms. Her book, Exit Strategy, a departure story, rested on her lap, already softened by hands who'd written it rather than shelved it. She opened to the front page. The dedication still made her pause. "To the women who flew alone and never flew back." A flight attendant passed, pausing when she saw the book. "Is that yours?" she asked, nodding to the cover. Ruth smiled. "Yes. I've seen this shared online. My mom loved it." She leaned down slightly. "She cried when she read the part about the gate." Ruth didn't flinch. "That was the first place I realized I could be left behind, and the last time I allowed it." The flight attendant's smile widened with something close to reverence. "Tea or champagne before takeoff?" "Tea," Ruth said, "with lemon." As the boarding process unfolded, passengers stumbled in, rushed, distracted, juggling headphones and backpacks. She watched them, not with judgment, but with detachment. Years ago, she might have counted how many children were traveling, or wondered if someone forgot their mother. Now she just sipped her tea, the citrus rising in quiet steam. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm even. "Welcome aboard, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be departing shortly. Cruising altitude 37,000 feet. Weather en route looks clear." Ruth folded the in-flight safety card back into its slot without glancing at it. She knew how to survive turbulence. She'd spent years learning that on land. She turned to the first chapter of her book and read aloud, but only softly. "They told me to wait. So I wrote myself a boarding pass." Outside, the sun edged up the horizon, early and golden, breaking clean through clouds. The cabin filled with hums and zippers, the quiet thud of overhead bins closing. The final passengers filed past her, never looking down, unaware they were walking past the author, the woman whose story had already flown further than most of them ever had. Ruth didn't mind. Recognition wasn't her currency anymore. The engines whirred, the nose tilted forward, wheels lifted clean off the ground, and Ruth reclined her seat, slowly, without apology. She didn't glance back toward the shrinking runway. She didn't search for her children's faces in passing crowds. She didn't wonder what would happen if they called again. She had earned this view, this moment, this seat. She had left the door unlocked long enough. She had waited at the terminal long enough. She had given grace until it bruised. Now she gave herself altitude. Above the clouds, she opened her journal and wrote the final line of the final entry. Then she closed the book, leaned her head back, and let the quiet take her. They left me grounded. I left them below,